Good afternoon and welcome to the final webinar in Eno's webinar series for 2021. Just for those of you who don't know, Eno is an independent, nonpartisan, and independent think tank that focuses on transportation policy and shapes public debate on critical multimodal transportation issues and builds an innovative network of transportation professionals. My name is Brianne Eby, and I'm a senior policy analyst at Eno. And today we'll be discussing current practices in transit network redesigns with Laura Biala and Shana Johnson from the Foursquare Integrated Transportation Planning. This research was conducted for the Transit Cooperative Research Program, and it was published earlier this year. I was also a part of the research team, so while I'll primarily be moderating today's discussion, I'll also present some of the work. Just a reminder to the audience members, you can answer or ask questions at any point in the box on the side of your screen, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can during the Q&A at the end of the presentation. We don't expect any tech issues with today's presentation, but just in case there are any, we found that exiting and re-entering the webinar tends to manage any of those issues that might pop up. Eno's happy to offer our webinars free of charge. If you do enjoy these, you are welcome to check out the link in the chat box or to donate or become a member of Eno. After today's presentation, you'll be able to find slides and a recording of the webinar on our website, enotrans.org. And today's recording will also be emailed to all registrants within one day. So with that, I will say take it away, Laura.
Okay, thank you, Brianne. And what an honor to be the closing webinar for 2021. So as Brianne mentioned, we're going to be talking about redesigning transit networks for the new mobility future. And just to introduce ourselves, my name is Laura Biala. I'm the founder, president, and CEO of Foursquare Integrated Transportation Planning. We're a multimodal transportation planning firm based in Washington, D.C. with several other offices. And we were the primary investigators on this TCRP report, and we also conduct bus network redesigns and transit service planning for many clients throughout the United States. Shana?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shana Johnson, and I'm the Vice President of Service Delivery and a Project Manager with Foursquare ITP. I also worked on one of the reports that we're going to be talking about today, TCRP 221, and I do a number of other project types at Foursquare as well, including leading our transportation demand management and parking practice. And I'll hand it over to you, Brianne.
I think Brianne already introduced herself, so I'm just going to keep on plowing through here. So the agenda we're going to follow today, first of all, go over the purpose of bus network redesigns, then a little bit on bus network redesign philosophies and approaches, provide an overview of key findings of the TCRP report, talk a little bit about new mobility and bus network redesigns, a little bit about pandemic impacts, because as we'll mention, the TCRP report research was finalized before the pandemic began, and then go into Q&A, and we're looking forward to that discussion. Throughout the presentation, we've put these two symbols on the right-hand side of your screen on each slide just to indicate which slides are the results coming out of the TCRP report and which slides with our little Foursquare ITP logo are those that are not coming out of the report. We definitely want to give you all a really high-level overview of the report, which Shana and Brianne will do, but we also recognize that, while it was published much earlier this year and the research was finished a year before that, we want to make sure that this is the presentation is still relevant today. So we're expanding the scope of what we'll talk about. So in terms of the purpose of a bus network redesign, let's just start by defining what we mean by that. A lot of agencies do call them redesigns. However, other agencies call them comprehensive operational analysis or transit development plan or a transit master plan. And the way that we define it in the report, and that we'll use it throughout this presentation, is that the most important distinction between bus network redesign and just the service planning and changes that an agency makes throughout the year normally is just that the bus network redesign is more comprehensive and holistic and looks at the system as a whole and sort of open, the agency is open to making broad brush changes to make the system work better and help meet their goals, as opposed to part of the system or just addressing an issue that they might have on a particular route or particular area. And really, to do bus network redesigns, it's the same skills and techniques used as those in service planning, making sure that you understand the transit market, understand the existing service performance, and make sure that all of that is married with a robust stakeholder and public engagement process. So why do agencies do redesigns? We like to say either because they have to, they need to, or they want to. Why might they have to? There are certain states, Virginia and Florida come to the top of my mind, that require periodic, complete service reviews of their entire system. Some agencies have their own internal requirements for reviewing their system at certain time intervals. So these are things that are required within an agency, and often agencies will use those opportunities as a reason to initiate a redesign because they're going to be looking at their system anyway. Other times agencies need to do it. There's no regulatory requirement, but they find themselves in a difficult financial situation where they need to reappropriate their resources to make the best use of limited resources. And when they do that, it really is important that the cuts are done in a manner that's thoughtful, data-driven, equitable, and minimize the impact on the riders and the community. And of course, these redesigns could be are generally long-term, but sometimes can be temporary, like we saw over the last couple of years to address pandemic-related ridership changes. And the third reason why an agency might initiate a redesign is because they want to. They have a vision that they want to meet. They want to serve existing riders better. They want to attract new riders, or they want to ensure that the agency is an even better steward of public funds and is financially responsible in terms of how to spend the money and get the biggest bang for their buck. So moving on to bus network redesign philosophies and approaches. One thing that's really important for agencies is to use hard data. Hard data is important. It's needed to tell a story and to engender trust. But it's equally as important to listen to what people have to say. What do the stakeholders say? What does the public say? And marry that up with what the numbers and the market says. So making sure that the plan is both people and data driven. Another part of the process is integrating, as I mentioned, planning and engagement throughout, making sure that they're inextricably linked. So in this example, which is sort of a high-level example of a bus network redesign process, the first phase of engagement might be to inform and involve the public and stakeholders, getting their input on the vision and the goals, feedback on market and service assessments, and getting their input at the start and making sure they feel like a part of the process. Later on, bringing them in to collaborate, provide feedback on service concepts, ensuring that it's very clear to the public how things are going to change their trip and how things are also going to change things from a systems perspective. And then again, towards the end, consulting on the final plan once changes have been incorporated, talking about implementation and some of the other things that will come with implementation, like updates to capital investments, new passenger amenities, new transfer facilities, and getting final impact on that, input on that. And then finally, in the implementation phase, this is more about education. Educate, educate, educate. You can never tell people too many times that that the changes are coming, because no matter how many times you do, there will still be somebody who says they've never heard. So can't do that enough. Another philosophy that most agencies are following, especially in the past few years regarding bus network redesigns, is a focus on equity from the perspective of analysis. So making sure that the system is analyzed from an equity perspective, ensuring that at a system level and a route level, it's reaching your low income, minority populations, those disadvantaged people that travel to essential jobs. Outreach also has to be equity focused, making sure that not only are you reaching out to all the populations, but that you're reaching out with staff that the communities can connect with. And finally, empathy. And I think this third one is often lost, but really going out with a deep understanding that even if the changes ultimately will serve the passengers better, for those that depend on transit, it is going to be a major change for them when their network changes. So making sure that the agency and any consultant staff that are out there really are showing that they understand that this is going to be a big challenge, and we know that eventually this is going to be helpful, but we get that this is going to be a disruption to your life, and showing that that empathy. The next part of redesigns that we see as sort of an overall philosophy and approach is being practical, making sure that people understand the implications of a bus network redesign, not just on theory, but it's important that people understand that there are trade-offs, especially when an agency is doing a redesign but in a cost-neutral manner. So there's no additional funding that's coming in, but rather finding better ways to use what they have. There are inherent trade-offs in that. So if there's an addition somewhere, there has to be a loss somewhere, and that needs to be communicated with the public and the stakeholders. And it's also important that the plans are geared towards meeting the specific goals that the agency has set, whether it's ridership goals, travel time reduction, reliability improvements, et cetera. And finally, in terms of communicating the impacts, what we found is really that network impacts are really hit home with stakeholders. So if you're talking about, the average person will have access to so many more jobs, or this many more people will have access to high frequency transit within a 10-minute walk, that's all really good and will resonate with your elected officials and your community-based organizers. But the route level engagement is really key for the people, because if somebody's route is changing, they aren't going to care that overall things improve at the system level. So it's important to make sure that things are communicated both at the system level and also at the individual level, to make sure that you achieve buy-in and good input throughout the process. The next thing I'll say that's a kind of an overall philosophy regarding bus network redesigns is, in addition to all the outreach that I've talked about, making sure that there's confidence in the data that you're using. It's so important that that the decisions be made based on data, that it's accurate data, and that the process to clean it and to view it is efficient, so that there's plenty of time in the schedule and budget to actually think about what decisions you want to make based on that data. A lot of agencies will use tools to support this process, whether it's visualizing the data in a way that people can understand, and also use it in a way that can be used for collaborative planning, so that the planning is done collaboratively with the agency, with the consultants, and with the stakeholders that are participating in the process. Almost at the end of these overall philosophies, the next one is to consider implementation and operations throughout the process. Most agencies, in fact, the vast majority, don't embark on a bus network redesign with the intention of putting it on a shelf. They embark on it with the intention of implementing it within a relatively short period of time. And so as the planning is going on, it's really important to be thinking about the impacts on operations, whether it's safe turns, layover locations, new transfer facilities that might be needed, new to operator training, to signage. All these things are things that are going to be that have to be done between when the planning is done and when the service is put on the ground. So it's important to keep that all in mind as you're going through, so that you don't have surprises at the end. And then most importantly, I think, is the ability to be flexible as one is doing a network redesign. One is to be context sensitive and have a tailored approach. The approach and the goals in mind might not be should not be the same, really, whether you're doing a network redesign in Brooklyn or Boise. They are very different places, different demographics, different levels of transit use, different populations. And so the redesign needs to be context sensitive to where it is. And then, of course, being adaptable as the project progresses, because as with most transportation projects, there are always going to be things that come your way that you're not expecting, whether it's being responsive to requests of the elected officials or changes in the world that are beyond your control. Being flexible and adaptable throughout the bus network redesign process are really important tenets. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Shana to provide you an overview of the TCRP report and our key findings from it.
Great, thank you, Laura. So over the past decade, we've seen numerous transit agencies undertake comprehensive redesigns of their bus networks. These agencies have realized that their legacy networks, which were often based in part on these mid-20th century streetcar routes, really were not serving the needs of communities today. There have been changes in demographics, land use, economics, technology, and most recently, the emergence of new mobility options in major US cities, all of which have spurred transit agencies to examine where bus service is provided, as well as the types and levels of service that's available, their multimodal connections, how to leverage new capital infrastructure, and also how to identify capital investments that need to be made. The question of the integration of new mobility options like microtransit and micromobility have also featured in these considerations of bus network redesigns. And agencies have the ability now to really access data sets that aid service planning that weren't available even just a few years ago. In many communities, there's also a growing recognition that the bus can play a big role in improving overall mobility, and that has also spurred agencies to undertake bus network redesigns. TCRP 221, the report that we're talking about today, was really undertaken to provide a better understanding of the existing work on the topic of bus network redesigns and how emerging mobility options are impacting them. The report provides guidance to help public transit agencies and other public entities with all aspects of bus network redesign. The work for the study began in January 2019 and it was finalized in July 2020. So as a result, it doesn't incorporate the impacts of COVID other than to speak to it briefly in the introductory matter. But other than that, the research, of course, for the report all precedes the pandemic. While this is a study about bus network redesigns, and therefore most of the agencies that and interviewees that participated in the research process were transit agencies and jurisdictions that operate transit service, because the study also addresses how new mobility is being incorporated into bus network redesigns or how it's been addressed separately, we did have a wide range of research participants. At the time that the study was being undertaken, bus network redesigns were primarily not directly incorporating new mobility. However, as we'll talk about a little bit later in this presentation, that has changed some since the research was completed. There's two main sections of the report itself and the resources that are associated with it. In the research report section, we provide a background on bus network redesigns and new mobility that provides more detail on the concept of bus network redesigns, key themes and trends in bus network redesign planning and implementation, trends in new mobility, and how new mobility was at the time being incorporated into bus network redesigns. The components of bus network redesigns has three parts. We get into the details of bus network redesign planning, including the process for service planning as part of the redesign, objectives and metrics for evaluating the plan, and incorporating the impact of new mobility and improvements undertaken as a part of the bus network redesigns. In the support and collaboration part of the research report, we cover all aspects of collaborating within the transit agency, including transit agency planning and administrative staff, working with bus operators and union leadership, and as well as collaborating with other stakeholders and agencies, gaining community buy-in, and working with boards and elected officials. The section on bus network redesign implementation provides an overview of how to implement a bus network redesign plan, including phased implementation, engagement, and education with the public during the implementation process, as well as how to follow up post-implementation to ensure that the plan is dynamic and responsive over time. And finally, we do provide some conclusions and next steps, which speak to our key findings from this research, as well as additional research that can further understanding of bus network redesigns. And in the resources section, we share 4 case studies from agencies that have conducted bus network redesigns and are in various stages of implementation. But we also have 3 toolkits that provide the reader with checklists and examples in 3 areas. The first one being an extensive toolkit on the elements of bus network redesign itself. The second, which speaks to how transit agencies can leverage partnerships, both intra-agency and interagency, and with the public sector, private sector. And the final toolkit talks the specific details of partnering with the private sector, and we'll be talking a little bit about those in this presentation as well today. I'm going to share what is really, I'd say, a very high level set of key findings from our report. Again, these are all available in quite some detail in the report itself if you are interested in learning more. Our first key finding from the research is that bus network redesigns are used to implement better bus service and other improvements to serve a region, and that a transit agency may wish to improve bus service quality, while other transit agencies have sought to tie together a variety of different improvements, including capital improvements, under the umbrella of a redesign. The second key finding is that bus network redesign should be framed by a strong decision-making process and leadership, and that having an agency leader that is the champion for the redesign is key to generating buy-in for the endeavor with the public, internal stakeholders, local jurisdictions, and other key partners. The third key finding is that well-articulated and coordinated goals are needed to ensure that everyone is working towards the same outcome for the bus network redesign. Transit agencies should establish parameters and goals early on for bus network redesigns to set expectations with stakeholders, the board, and the public. Parameters for changes to the system should be developed and applied at all stages of the decision-making process. Our fourth key finding is that bus network redesigns should be built upon agreed upon design principles, service types, and service design guidelines. Because of the breadth of changes that are recommended through a bus network redesign, transit agencies use the occasion often to review and update their key service planning guidance documents, including service design and service performance guidelines. This not only provides the planners with a structure under which to conduct the planning activities, but also provides the transit agency with documented reasoning for the changes that can be used in discussions with the public and stakeholders. And our fifth key finding is that frequent and meaningful engagement with stakeholders and the public is important. This really cannot be overstated, as there is no such thing as too much public engagement, outreach, and communication when planning and implementing a bus network redesign. Outreach is a key element at all phases of the bus network redesign process, and even with significant amounts of engagement, transit agencies should still expect some challenges come time for implementation. Key finding number 6 is that new mobility services are currently being piloted, and that the planning for new mobility has, at least at the time of this research, was not yet widely integrated into bus network redesign planning, and I will delve into that more in a moment. The seventh key finding of the report is that equity considerations are integral to bus network redesign planning efforts. At most transit agencies, buses do serve a higher proportion of low-income minority, limited English proficient, and other historically disadvantaged populations than other transit modes. The impact of changes to the bus network on these populations must be closely considered. TCRP Report 221 explored the integration of equity primarily through the lens of compliance with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as well as with the Americans with Disabilities Act. However, several transit agencies in our research noted that their bus network redesigns analyses of equity went beyond these requirements. Finally, key finding number 8 is that the implementation of bus network redesigns, both on the operating side and with supporting capital elements, is incredibly involved and requires participation from all parts of the transit agency, as well as local jurisdictions and other key stakeholders. At its simplest, a bus network redesign can be implemented with limited capital investments, such as new bus stop signs, expanded layover facilities, or additional space for transfer at existing facilities. However, more capital-intensive bus network redesigns require transit agencies to work closely with local jurisdictions to coordinate investments and bus priority treatments, new and expanded passenger stop and transfer facilities, and other first and last mile improvements. Now I'm going to speak to specifically the topic of new mobility and bus network redesigns. And so at the time that TCRP 221 research was being undertaken, transit agencies were predominantly in this stage of piloting and experimenting with the integration of new mobility into their service offerings broadly. And so for the bus network redesigns that had been completed prior to our research, or that were being undertaken at the time of the research, most of them had not very widely integrated these new options with the redesign planning process. What we found is that things like MicroTransit, partnerships with transportation network companies, micromobility, and the development of mobility hubs were all things that were typically considered in parallel or as a pilot, and were at the time loosely associated with the bus network redesign if they were. But we did find that most of the agencies that participated in our research were in the process of experimenting piloting, implementing a variety of these new mobility options, and several types of approaches and use cases for implementing new mobility in the context of bus network redesigns were identified in the research. The most common of these was the use of microtransit to enhance service coverage and service quality. The other use cases for the integration of new mobility into bus networks included the desire to enhance system access, reduce operating costs versus operating a fixed route bus service in an area, and to enhance transportation equity. For example, to increase system access, we found that the Maryland Transit Administration worked with the City of Baltimore to install bike share stations at key transfer points at the time that they implemented the Baltimore Link bus network redesign, even though at a later point, the bike share vendor discontinued their services. And we found that several of the transit agencies that took part in the research for the report were really looking at these new mobility options through this lens of equity. For example, Los Angeles Metro's pilot partnership with a microtransit provider aimed to reduce barriers to first and last mile service at 2 rail stations and a bus terminal in areas they had identified where there was a specific concentration of disadvantaged communities. And initially, this pilot provided service only to or from stations or the bus terminal, but during COVID, they actually expanded it to provide point-to-point trips to other destinations like grocery stores, medical facilities within the zone. As I mentioned, the most common application use case for new mobility within the context of bus network redesigns was to enhance service coverage and quality. And we can see on the next slide that the Utah Transit Authority was one of the agencies that participated in our search, and they had a microtransit pilot from in November 2019 to explore how microtransit could serve part of their service area that had relatively low ridership on an existing deviated route bus service. Within 3 months of launching their pilot, they found that the ridership expectations they had for it were met, even though they had kept the existing route deviation transit service in place in the pilot service area. Half of the trips taken in their pilot service area were to connect to their rail stations. That was a lot more than what they initially expected, would have been a quarter of trips. And they believe that the pilot for the microtransit service, the strong performance that they did see for it indicated that there was previously unmet transit demand in that service area and have since incorporated considerations about microtransit into their service choices bus network redesign planning process. Another example of this is Capital Metro in Austin, Texas, their CAP remap bus network redesign. They created mobility innovation zones for on-demand service, with 3 of the 4 zones being located in areas that were predominantly minority in nature. And the zones were initially proposed in response to a planned loss of fixed route bus service in those communities where both the residents of the communities and the agency's board felt more service was still needed. And at the time that the report's research was concluded, the service, now known as Pickup, was operating in 8 zones with further zones planned. Finally, I'll just touch briefly on this other next topic, which is that inclusion of on-demand service, on-demand transit service, microtransit in bus network redesigns is certainly growing. And so subsequent to TCRP Report 221, we also led what is now the forthcoming very soon TCRP Synthesis 159, which was specifically on bus network redesigns and equity. And the survey for the synthesis found that 45% of the 39 agencies who responded to the synthesis survey had incorporated microtransit or another type of on-demand transit partnership into their redesign. And so that was significantly more than our research work for TCRP 221. The image on the slide is from RTS Regional Transit System in Rochester, New York. And they looked very specifically at microtransit because one of their redesign's goals was, and direction from their board, was that no one who had access to transit prior to the redesign should lose access to transit in the redesign system. And so you can see they followed a 3-step process, and MicroTransit and through these community mobility zones was an integral part of that planning process. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Brianne to talk about the toolkits and TCRP Report 221 in more detail.
Okay, thanks so much, Shayna. So I'll be covering the 3 toolkits that we put together as part of this research. And these toolkits were designed to facilitate the planning and implementation of bus network redesigns, as well as partnering with the private sector as part of a bus network redesign. And so the toolkits are meant to help transit agencies and other stakeholders put research into practice, and they're designed with checklists and resources that readers can use in order to tailor that information to their needs. So I'll go through each of those right now. And I think, yeah, toolkit number 1 is pulled up. So the first toolkit is focused on, at a really high level, the key topic areas that transit agencies seeking to conduct a bus network redesign should be considering before they go through that process. And we first discuss in the toolkit when and whether to conduct a bus network redesign. We also developed a phasing timeline to help transit agencies understand how key topic areas related to network redesigns can fit into each phase of the planning and implementation process. And so before going into detail on the toolkit, I'll just pause here to note that what you see on the screen is an example of the checklist that we've inserted throughout all of the toolkits as part of the report. And so the general format is that readers can consider specific questions within broader topic areas, like in this case, setting fare policies. So some of the toolkits are formatted such that respondents should be able to answer yes to at least one factor in each category, and others are simply areas for consideration throughout the planning process. Okay, next slide. So this slide lists the key components of bus network redesigns, which are all included in the toolkit. And for each, I'd like to just walk through a brief description of what it means and why the factor was included in the toolkit. So with respect to goals and objectives, establishing clear and agreed upon goals and objectives can guide the planning and ultimately the final product that results. And this entails setting goals that meet the needs of both internal and external stakeholders. So for performance metrics, these are things like the number of planned revenue hours and miles. Performance metrics can ultimately help to evaluate progress toward specific goals that were previously identified, as well as to help understand the existing conditions of the transit network and maybe even to set new goals. Trade-offs is the next one, trade-offs, parameters, and service types. So this toolkit helps readers think through the different effects that a network redesign may have, for instance, on changes to things like operating costs or trade-offs between frequency and coverage, for example. It also helps readers think through how external factors like budgets and neighboring agencies might affect the redesign process. Finally, it discusses how different service types, so high frequency, local, circulator, covered service, can affect the network redesign. The next one is board and elected official involvement. So area leaders can be certainly advocates for a redesign. Involving them early and often in the process can contribute to a smoother redesign process. The next one is coordinating and managing within the agency. So internal coordination of project management is an important part of establishing a smooth process, especially at large transit agencies that maybe have a lot of internal departments. Next one I'll go through is planning transit service. So to better plan the appropriate service types for different areas and different needs, agencies should be considering factors like equity, facility, capacity, travel patterns, and the built environment. Determining fare policies and fare interoperability between modes is another factor. So the redesign process should take into consideration the capacity for changes to fare structures, given the agency's current fare policies and fare collection systems. Next ones are conducting public and stakeholder engagement. So feedback from a range of voices is imperative to a successful network redesign, as we've discussed already. Robust community engagement can affect the level of support that the community ultimately has for the redesign process. Next factor is addressing capital elements. So capital considerations for a transit network redesign include new buses for service expansion, bus type, bus priority treatments, factors like that. And then finally, planning for implementation. So staging elements are important to consider in order to accommodate new service. And this includes things like whether the service will be implemented all at once or phased in, as well as operational aspects like scheduling, signage, marketing, and GTFS creation. Next slide. Okay, so toolkit number 2 considers engagement within and between transit agencies and other local agencies and governments, as well as engagement with the private sector in order to adopt new strategies for service delivery. So we evaluated four key strategies used by transit agencies and by their partners to make the bus the mode of choice. The first factor here is bus priority. So this includes things like strategies like dedicated bus lanes, transit service priority queue jumps. In the example that we have in the toolkit is the Central Ohio Transit Agency partnered with the City of Columbus, which is the roadway right-of-way owner, and other stakeholders throughout the process to plan for bus priority via dedicated bus lanes. The second factor is account-based fare systems and app-based transit platforms. So these platforms facilitate service integration among multiple providers, including bike share, car share, new mobility options. And our example in the toolkit here is Indigo in Indianapolis, which is implementing an account-based fare system called MyKey. And that system features a mobile application and reloadable fare cards that can, in the future, be used to integrate different modes, trip planning, booking, and fare value purchases into the app. And the agency also partnered with other transit agencies for lessons learned, as well as various internal departments within the agency, like customer service, IT, et cetera. Next factor here is MicroTransit. So this is also known as demand response or flex transit. This enables real-time on-demand transit trip scheduling on an app or via phone. It's used to provide greater coverage in underserved areas. And our example in the toolkit here is Gwinnett County Transit Division in suburban Atlanta, which piloted MicroTransit from 2018 to 2019. With help from a third-party contractor, and that service ultimately provided drivers and mobility companies with the service app and operator training. And the final example here is real-time passenger information. So real-time information provides passengers with accurate arrival and departure times for specific buses via things like information screens, smartphone or web applications, or via telephone. And our example in the toolkit is the Lehigh and Northampton Transportation Authority in Allentown, Pennsylvania, which use real-time info in their smartphone and web apps to enhance passengers' transit experiences. They also partnered with key departments within the transit agency. Next slide, please. Okay, so the next toolkit goes into specific detail on partnering with the private sector, which can take a bunch of different forms, like leveraging private vendors for operations and maintenance of traditional fixed route services, potentially having partners provide on-demand service that links to the agency's fixed route, or using a private company's software or technical expertise to operate different or new forms of service. And so there are many motivations for partnering with the private sector, but two of the main ones that we uncovered in this research are that the transit agency maybe doesn't have in-house capacity to provide some or all of its service, or potentially the agency wants to enhance its ability to achieve accountability and performance standards. And partnering can be useful in some contexts, but it can also come with regulatory and legal challenges. So regulations for partnerships are often unclear, but they can have major implications for the contractual partnership between the public and private sectors. So for example, the Americans with Disabilities Act requires transit agencies to ensure that private sector partners comply with the same requirements that the transit agencies themselves must adhere to. However, these requirements do not apply when private entities are regulated by public entities or receive a permit to operate from public entities. Or, for example, when the public entity provides subsidies to private companies for services that they already operate. So private sector companies typically don't have the same capability to provide equivalent services for customers with disabilities. So just one, regulatory consideration that should be considered. Next slide, please. So finally, in toolkit number 3, we also discussed the different types of risks that transit agencies may take on by partnering with the private sector. So for example, with respect to operational risk, if a transit agency partners with a provider that then goes out of business, like the bike share example that I think was provided earlier, the transit agency might find or needs to find another way to provide that service. Other forms of risk might include financial risk, reputational or regulatory risk, and these can all be interrelated in some ways. So for example, with respect to the example I already gave about a transit agency needing to find other ways to provide service if a partner goes out of business, there may be elements of reputational and financial risk that the agency also takes on in the event of interrupted service. And so with that, I will turn it back to Laura to close us out.
Okay, trying to get the slide to advance. So thanks, Brianne and Shana. So because most of the TCRP research, or all of the TCRP research, as we mentioned, happened before the pandemic, we did want to just close out with, I believe there are 5 observations we've made about how COVID has impacted bus network redesigns since the research was completed. So the first is, as I'm sure everybody knows, is the changing travel patterns and demand. You know, that really has changed throughout the pandemic, and even now as we're starting to get into the recovery. There's some, as we know, some transit use never changed, especially for people going to essential jobs. But commuting to other jobs, you know, went to a complete standstill and is now starting to come back quite a bit. But in many cases, the transit agencies are finding themselves, you know, ability to hire operators not ignored, in a bit of a chicken and egg situation, right? There's less demand, but you want to bring back enough service to encourage people to take transit when they do come back to work. So there's a little bit of figuring out the best way to do that right now. You know, at the same time, while people will eventually come back to work, we know that it's not likely for those with desk jobs, like many of us on the phone, will not be coming back 5 days a week. The peaks will be further spread out than they are now, not quite as peaky. And so in bus network redesigns that are ongoing right now and will be started in the future, that all has to be taken into consideration in the planning process. The second observation about COVID is that planned redesigns have proceeded. We noticed that most redesign work stalled in 2020 because agencies had much more important and urgent priorities. As the corner turned into 2021, we saw lots of those redesigns that had been on pause restart. And in fact, a lot of new ones kick off this year. For example, SEPTA in Philadelphia, DART in Dallas is doing a redesign right now. LA Metro recently completed theirs. And even in a small place like Muskegon, Michigan, which is the pictures you see on the slide, they were able to finish their redesign right at the beginning of the pandemic and actually implement it during the pandemic, which has been very successful for them because they were able to kind of educate people over time. Our third observation about COVID's impacts to bus network redesigns is that, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of agencies are going back and revisiting their previous redesigns that they may have completed only right before the pandemic. Obviously, things are very different now. So they're going back to ensure that those plans that they developed still serve the needs that were identified before the pandemic. And this picture here is just an example of the first phase of a re-optimized service that JTA in Jacksonville, Florida, just implemented in September to respond to the changing needs that came from the pandemic, even though they had done a redesign a few years before the pandemic. Our third COVID observation is, even though we talked about equity, there's obviously been a greater emphasis on essential services as a result of the pandemic, and notice that evaluating route essentialness can really help direct planning in a post-COVID environment. In this analysis here, just to show an example, this is a way that we see some agencies looking at their route. So looking at the equity value that a route brings to the system in terms of the people who are riding that route, but also the people that have access to that route. And as that compares with ridership, and focusing the redesign efforts more on those that have a higher equity value and a higher ridership value to get the biggest bang for the buck, and try to focus on routes and services in the redesign that will get them more toward their equity goals. And then the last COVID observation, as Shana alluded to, is just a much greater emphasis on new mobility. We're seeing most redesigns now incorporating new mobility within the confines of the redesign itself, so that the agency is planning for fixed route as well as complementary microtransit at the same time, as opposed to them being two parallel efforts, to ensure that the residents and workers of the region have the right level of service and the right type of service to meet all their needs. As Shana mentioned, the full report is available online at trb.org, and you can read lots and lots of detail there. And with that, we will go into Q&A.
Okay, thanks so much to both of you. That was a great presentation. We've already had a bunch of questions come in. The audience is encouraged to continue to submit questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can in the 15 minutes or so that we have left. So I will start with a question. Laura, since you just brought up bringing equity analyses into focus, let's maybe start with that. A few folks have had questions about that. So one, I guess just really broadly, what are some good examples of equity-focused goals and metrics that you've seen in your work or that come up in the report maybe? And then another related one, somebody mentioned that a challenge, frequent challenge with equity analyses is that the data sometimes drives an evaluation of the residents of the customer rather than maybe a work or a service destination. And this might not be as geared toward customers who reverse commute and are often going to locations that are, just kind of different in maybe not considered to be an area of disadvantage. Any thoughts on how to address that particular issue? And again, more broadly, just the general question about good examples of equity-focused goals and metrics.
Sure. Well, I'll answer the second question first because I have a great, I have a visual that we just, where is it? This one. I did one thing I think I glossed over, and that agencies are looking at to get at that very point about reverse commutes and access to kind of the lower wage jobs. When we're looking at equity, we're not just looking at the riders of the route or the people who live along the route, but also the destinations. We're incorporating into the equity value. So what social services centers are there, what healthcare facilities, retail and restaurant densities, because that obviously impact those two, all of those industries that I just mentioned attract lower wage workers and therefore lower income population. So that's a good way to incorporate the need of a particular route, not just by who lives there, but also the types of destinations that route serves. In terms of equity metrics or goals and metrics, I've seen a variety. I think one of the most important things to think about is when we're thinking about true equity, is not to rely just on Title VI. If you look at most agencies' Title VI programs, the low income threshold is usually quite low. And there's a lot of people whose households fall above that threshold that are still disadvantaged and at risk. And so I think it's important to look broader than Title VI, and most agencies I think are, and setting metrics in terms of access to, increased access to jobs between not just low income and minority individuals, not just jobs in general, but jobs within certain sectors, right? Like it doesn't matter that there are, that there's a financial district in your downtown and there's 50,000 jobs, because that's not the jobs. Yeah, sure, there's a few, administrative assistant positions, but for the most part, those are not the jobs that you're trying to serve for those communities. So it's matching up your low-income people, looking at access to jobs for the low-income people and the types of jobs that they would necessarily take. Those are just some initial thoughts. I don't know, Shana, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit to this. As I mentioned, we also recently completed TCRP Synthesis 159, which is on equity and bus network redesigns. It has not yet been published, but I think it will be very soon. And in that research, we had the survey, but we also did 6 in-depth case studies with transit agencies, specifically focused on this topic of what types of equity analyses are you doing that are not Title VI related, and how is equity established as a goal or being incorporated in this process. And so the 6 agencies are obviously diverse that we studied in this research, from smaller agencies like Lane Transit in Eugene, Oregon, and mid-sized agencies as well as to the nation's largest agencies in MBTA in Boston and LA Metro, and specifically to this question about looking at trips that are looking at trips as a measure as opposed to residences. Both Los Angeles Metro and MBTA utilized cell phone data, location-based services data, trip information in their planning process. And MBTA has done a very advanced version of this where they understand who is traveling and how they're traveling throughout their service area, not just for transit trips, but for all trips, because they're really trying to design their service to better serve all trips. And so because they've been able to have this very advanced data analysis, and they are able to make inferences about whether those trips are being made by people who are part of some type of disadvantaged group or equity population as they have defined it, they have a great understanding of how those populations are traveling, and that is really being incorporated in their planning process, which is ongoing right now. And so this is described in detail in the TCRP Synthesis 159. There's also a couple of existing papers that MBTA staff have already published in academic journals on this methodology. So if that's something that is of interest, of course, you know how you can reach Laura and I, and we're happy to share that with anybody who might be interested in looking at that particular approach in detail.
Great. Yeah, a lot of questions have come in about the equity component involved in all this. I'll move on next to some questions that have come in about community engagement and public notice around the process. And Shana, maybe I'll direct this one to you, but as always for both of you, if you want to jump in, please do. So one person asked if there are any federal requirements such as public notice or meetings that have to be met before a network redesign and bus changes can be implemented. So what are kind of the federal or even state or local requirements that need to be met, and how to account for those? And then another kind of related question that came in was if there's any advice that you have on including non-riders or choice riders into the redesign, and how to pull non-riders into the public engagement process.
I'll answer the first half of that question and let Laura talk to the engagement with the choice riders in the planning process. So in terms of just the regulations related to Title VI, agencies are required to have a public participation plan that details how they're going to undertake inclusive public engagement throughout any planning process. But that is something that each agency develops on their own. And so with relation to the guidance, the regulation that is in place for civil rights in transit, there is not something that says all agencies must conduct this particular set of outreach at this time. Now that said, each agency has their own internal guidance, state regulations that may well be indicating when they will have to undertake public engagement related to service change as a requirement. And so then I will let Laura talk to the choice rider question.
Yeah, so obviously getting engagement from anybody is always a challenge, right? Because people are very busy, and I think we all discovered during the pandemic that that we actually got a lot more engagement on our projects doing virtual engagement, because people could attend regardless of whether they had other obligations, and if they didn't have childcare, that was no problem. They could just sign into their computer. That said, as the person who asked the question probably knows, that if you have a virtual public meeting about a bus network redesign, if they don't ride the bus, they're not going to think that's for them, so they're not going to show. When we do, and most agencies do public outreach related to bus network redesigns, they're doing a lot of proactive engagement out in the field, pop-ups, and of course, a lot of them are held at bus transfer centers and other locations where you might find bus riders so that you can get their input. But what we found is pretty helpful is also going to locations that are a little more auto-oriented, whether it's a suburban shopping center where you might get some bus riders who came there, and also some folks that don't ride the bus. going out to places like grocery stores. We've set up pop-ups inside a grocery store or at an outdoor mall to get that input. And then besides the pop-ups, the other way that that I found is best to reach those populations is through existing organizations. So homeowners associations and renters associations, also business organizations like the Board of Trade and Chambers of Commerce tend to have a lot of members who are not focused on transit and might not otherwise know about the project, but might want to weigh in. And so those are some ways to reach those people. And then once you've reached them, of course, it's important to figure out what you want to tell them and what you want to ask them, so that their input can be useful, but also not derail the whole process.
Okay, I'm hoping we can get a couple more questions in here. Shana, I'll point this one at you. So with respect to performance measures, somebody asked at what point the transit agency sets the performance measures that can evaluate the success of a transit network redesign. And then another perhaps related question was, whether sustainability can be incorporated into evaluating the success of a network redesign. Maybe also related to that, somebody asked about bus electrification and how to kind of differentiate between traditional buses versus electric buses and whether that's incorporated. So all of these kind of I think speak to the issue of performance metrics.
Right. I would say that from at least the research that we have undertaken, I don't see necessarily sustainability often being a outright goal in a lot of these bus network redesigns. Laura, feel free to chime in if you've seen some others that might speak to the contrary recently. But as we mentioned in the key findings, one of the first sort of things that you need to do in undertaking your bus network redesign is really to establish these agreed upon principles under which the redesign is going to be undertaken. Looking at those design principles, the service types, the design guidelines, and what types of metrics you are going to be measuring the performance of your service against. Because, if you wait until the end to sort of establish these types of parameters, you may go back and apply them and find the planning process that you're undertaking is not going to achieve the performance goals, metrics, et cetera, that you would like to see for the plan. So that should be, integral to the beginning part of the project. And Laura, I don't know if you have any other insight on sustainability and how.
I don't on the goal side, but the one thing I will add is that, as so many agencies right now are working on transition plans to zero emission vehicles, one thing that was not mentioned at all in our research, and really I think is very nascent in the bus network redesign approach, is that the charging impacts of electric vehicles and the distance impacts. And so as agencies start to do those plans and as they're doing redesigns, I think those two need to be married so that they're not developing a new bus network that, as the agency starts bringing on more electric vehicles, they have to kind of restructure it in order to achieve their charging units. So that's the only thing that I've seen, and it's something that I don't think anybody is doing yet. Well, I'm sure there's somebody that I'm not aware of, but I think that's kind of the next horizon.
Okay, and one final question with the minute or so that we have left. I know you talked a bit about the pandemic, but do you have any advice for agencies that are maybe just now beginning a redesign, how to handle the ongoing pandemic, or how to anticipate what might be different in a few years? Or you certainly can't fully anticipate that, but how should transit agencies start the process at this point?
Yeah, I think to an extent, agencies should be looking at pre-pandemic, can still be looking at pre-pandemic data for travel flows, both on transit and also just general travel flows, as Shana talked about. Because the travel flows for the most part aren't going to be very much different, but the demand and the time of day and the level of demand at different times of day is going to be different. And so I think it's going to be the analysis has to kind of be a blend of the patterns from before the pandemic and the levels from now. And agencies just need to think about the industries in their region and the people in their region and tailor it, I think, to their specific region. Nobody has a crystal ball. But I think that probably towards the end of 22, early 23, things should be back to kind of a not to what it was before, but to some status quo. And so that's something that, you know, as agencies that are starting on now need to consider, that things are going to continue to change for a little while still.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Laura and Shana. Really fantastic presentation, and thanks to the audience for your engagement. And just a reminder to the audience that the slides and a recording of this webinar will be available on eKnow's website after this event closes out. The recording will also be emailed to everybody within 1 day. Make sure to stay up to date on all of eKnow's work through our mailing list to gain access to our monthly newsletter, our webinar announcements, report releases, etc. And again, I'll just thank everybody and have a good afternoon and Happy New Year. Thanks.